Well, thanks for coming back and welcome to part 2 of Stalking Boudicca, the video series that aims to establish where the battle site for Boudicca's last stand was and what the current theories are for it. If you've dropped into part 2 straight away, why not go back and have a look at part 1? That kind of sets the scene. In this part we're going to look at further individual sites, most of the 12 sites that we'll be looking at on these videos. The next couple of sites are quite interesting. They're further east than the majority of the sites that are nominated, and they're based on the principle that the Iceni were retreating from their raids on London and St Albans and using the Icknield Way as a way back to their homeland. In the first case, we're going to look at Arbury Banks, where Graham Appleby suggests that the Roman troops interdicted the Iceni troops as they were coming back. The site itself at Arbury Banks is a small hill fort on a low rise, and Graham has spotted a couple of Roman temples, or what appear to be a couple of Roman temples in the vicinity. As a strategic framework for how the campaign might have evolved with this turn eastwards from St Albans, it's an interesting theory. The terrain isn't dramatic, certainly not dramatic in the way one looks at the Tacitus description, but if the terrain wasn't the key element and the woods were the key element, then maybe this has the potential to be the site. The most easterly of the nominated sites is the village of Hayden on the Cambridgeshire-Hertfordshire border. This is nominated by William Foote. William's a renowned academic in the field of defence studies, and he based his ideas on Graham Appleby's assertion that the Iceni might well have taken the northern route back to their homelands. In his case, he assumed the Romans didn't get ahead of the Iceni, but rather they tried to bottle them up. The Hayden site certainly does have dramatic topography. It has a strong northeast trending valley overlooking a plain, so that fits the description quite well. It's a very tight valley in terms of topography, so it's hard to see how a legion could deploy on that ground. And the flanks seem quite exposed. The rise up onto the chalk ridge that Hayden is based on is quite a simple thing to move around. So again, topographically, it's quite a weak suggestion in terms of guarding its flanks and its rear. But as with Arbury Banks, if the principal defence were the woods rather than the topography, this might be a credible candidate. So let's talk about Watling Street now. As I mentioned previously, Paulinus had probably used the route of Watling Street to go from the southeast up to attack the Druids on Anglesey or Mona. We know two of the towns that were sacked, St Albans and London, are on the line of Watling Street, and we know it's within a reasonable marching distance of the Iceni territory in Norfolk. So in terms of troop movement and proximity to places that are named as part of the rebellion, Watling Street makes a lot of sense, and in fact the battle has been dubbed the Battle of Watling Street in terms of its preference for where the site might have been. And as we look at the candidate sites along Watling Street or very close to Watling Street, it's almost as if every potential valley, every defile and a few other sites have been named. So it's almost a case of researchers going along, blagging a valley, naming the valley as the site, and then trying to fit the actions to match and try and find archaeological hints that might have been the site. Since 1962, the dominant theory of the battle site has been Manchester in Warwickshire. Now this theory was put forward in a book by Dudley and Webster in 1962 and has remained pretty much unchallenged through to the present day. If you get a chance to have a look on YouTube, Michael Wood's documentary In Search of Boudicca actually has Webster being interviewed on the site at Manchester, and so it's quite a useful historic document in itself. Now Manchester doesn't have the topographic characteristics one would expect, so it's surprising it's held its position in academia so long as the preferred site. It's actually quite a steep ridge rising above the River Plain. So there is the Great Plain and there is a steep ridge, but there's no valley to be defended. But as part of a local industry, Boudicca's really embedded in Manchester and in Atherstone, and the locals won't be letting it go anytime soon. There is a Roman settlement or fort there, Manduessendum, which is supposed to mean the place of the chariots, and that seems to have been Webster's key clue to the site being there. But also there have been scraps of lorica found there too. The original battle plan set out by Webster in his book in 1962 is a diagram that doesn't involve a valley. It shows the Romans defending a point on the toe of the ridge in line abreast facing a flat plain. So the form of the battle here doesn't really take the form that Tacitus suggests, with the throat of the valley being so important. There are a few ravines that run up the ridge, but nothing you could really deploy a legion in, and even with the large quarries taken out of the equation, there's still really no sign that the topography fits well here. As an interesting footnote, the protagonist behind one of the other sites claimed to have had almost a deathbed confession from Webster that in fact he didn't believe Mansetta was the site, and that he'd nominated the site in '62 in order to engage in a debate, to get people thinking about where the site could have been. That certainly happened, and I think most commentators now accept that Mansetta is an unlikely setting due to its topography and location, far, far away from the Iceni homelands, and the hunt for evidence has been active and no evidence has been found. Following Watling Street southeast for a short distance, we get to our next site, which is High Cross in Leicestershire. High Cross is a very interesting site strategically because it's the junction of the Fosse Way with Watling Street, and so it would have been a significant transport node in the Roman period. And this, I assume, is why the strategic significance has played a part in this site being nominated by two authors. A brief nomination came in 1979 from Kevin Carroll, but the site's nomination is really down to John Waite, who gave a very clear explanation of the site in his 2011 book Boudicca's Last Stand. John has noted what he believes are a number of marching camps and earthworks in the vicinity of the site. His diagram shows a force of Romans holding the crossroads between Fosse Way and Watling Street, and the Iceni forces approaching directly from the east. I can't identify a valley in this location, so this is another one of those sites that is a candidate with a good topography, a high ground and a low ground, very distinctly set apart, but again very little by way of a defile throat, forcing the force of the Iceni to compress in the middle. Further south along Watling Street we come across a ridge overlooking a great plain, which is a classic for the description of the battle site. The site's name is Clifton-on-Dunsmore, and this was nominated by Chris Kinsella and Kerry Sullivan. The ridge occupied by Clifton-on-Dunsmore sits directly across Watling Street, and so presents a real topographic barrier to movement along Watling Street, which makes it a good candidate. And there is a Great Plain, although I'm not sure quite what the state of the Great Plain would have been in 61 AD. It looks to me like it might have been rather marshy, as it is so flat. Whilst medieval defences are very obvious on the site, there's no obvious Roman defences that you can pick up on, any field fortifications or more permanent fortifications. And the medieval forts seem to more be inclined towards defending from the east than directly from the south, which is the battle plan that Chris and Kerry have put forward. But again, the biggest issue that I have with this site is the lack of a defile. It is a very strong high ground, it is a very strong ridge, very defensible, but it lacks the characteristic of the defile that Tacitus is so specific about. Strategically, the site lies slightly north of the Watford Gap, the watershed, the north of which lies the Trent, the south of which lies the Nen and the Ouse. And whilst there's nothing definitive about this watershed, it does seem to me that that ridge that stretches across the country is likely to have played some kind of role in territorial divisions at this stage. The next site we're going to look at is Cuttle Mill in Northamptonshire. This is nominated by Martin Marix Evans, a publisher and trained as a lawyer. But it was a favoured site in the 2004 documentary by Dan and Peter Snow, Battlefield Britain, Boudicca's Revolt. So that drew it to national attention. The site is a small defile that trends east-west across Watling Street, which gives the valley characteristics that Martin was looking for to match with Tacitus. Also within the area, Martin had come across the remains of, well, human remains of women and children. So he based this on battle casualties, and he did some marching distance calculations. And these marching distance calculations, which were similar to those done by Graham Appleby, made this the obvious place for him to pull up the Boudiccan forces in a watering place, having travelled up the Nen Valley, avoiding the Whittlewood Forest. So the Cuttlemill site would seemingly tick all the necessary boxes. However, the human remains that were found, I believe, have been radiocarbon dated to the Anglo-Saxon period and are quite a simple civilian cemetery. And the topography of the site is actually quite low. So rather than the striking defile that one would expect from the Tacitus description, they're a weaker, lower topography, which don't seem to have the necessary either height or steepness to act as a defensive position. It should be noted that both the Snows in their documentary favoured this site, but also the Battlefields Trust, who was very keen on this for a period, and undertook some metal detecting surveys of the site. They came up with nothing conclusive, and the case is then made that the battlefield was so well known it was in fact picked clean. So that's the end of part 2, but part 3, which is just a short snippet, really has the top 3 candidate sites. So it'd be great if you could find your way to part 3 now, and we can conclude this, and you can give some views on which site you think is the best.